In a world that told women to be delicate, small, and soft-spoken, Eleanor Grace was none of those things. She stood 6'2", barefoot with broad shoulders, strong hands, and a stride that didn't know how to tiptoe. She didn't flutter, didn't blush easily, and certainly didn't ask permission to reach the top shelf. But how many times she wished she could shrink. They never said it outright. They just glanced upward when she walked in. They asked if she played basketball. They joked, "You'll have to find a man who stands on a crate." And she smiled politely. Every time. Because what else could she do? Eleanor learned to bow her head slightly in photos, to wear flat shoes even when she longed for something with grace. She folded herself inward as if her body and presence were an inconvenience she was apologizing for just by existing. By the time she was 38, the world had passed her over so many times she stopped raising her hand. She stopped hoping. Until one winter, out of quiet rebellion or quiet desperation, she answered a mail-order bride ad. A lumber mill foreman in Washington Territory wanted someone sturdy, capable. Not a porcelain doll, he wrote. For a brief moment, she let herself wonder. What if, but when she stepped off the stagecoach after a week's journey, he took one look at her tall, strong, unshakable, and walked away. Didn't even say her name. Didn't even try. Just sent word through a stranger. Didn't expect you to be that tall. Wouldn't work. She stood there in the cold letter still in hand, coat pulled tight. And if that were the end, you'd understand. But it wasn't. Because across the street, there was a man taller than most in spirit, if not in inches, who saw her not as too much, but as just enough. He wasn't the man who'd placed the ad. He didn't come with flowers or flattery, but he looked at her, really looked, and didn't flinch. And that's where this story begins. Not with love at first sight, but with someone who never once asked her to crouch. Have you ever been told you take up too much space, that you need to tone it down slim, it down quiet, it down just to be loved? Then maybe this story is for you. Stay with us, because sometimes the love that fits best is the one that doesn't ask you to fit in. Eleanor Grace stood 6 feet and 2 inches tall. In a world of corsets, dainty ankles, and men who wanted to feel taller by comparison, she was a walking oddity. Strangers stared. Suitors stammered. Shopkeepers smiled politely, then suggested she try the men's section for boots. She had learned early on to shrink without bending, to hunch her shoulders just enough not to stand out in church, to fold her hands when she spoke and keep her sentences short. Her mother once told her a woman should be graceful, Eleanor, not towering. But grace was hard to conjure when you had to duck through door frames and couldn't share a dance without the man standing on a box. At 38, Eleanor had long abandoned the idea of fitting in. She lived with quiet dignity, working odd jobs, tending the garden, stitching hems for the town's shorter women. Her heart was still soft, though she kept it guarded, like an heirloom wrapped in cloth and placed high on a shelf where no one ever reached. Then one day she did something brave. She answered a mail-order bride ad from a lumber supervisor out west. The letter had been short, nearly gruff. "I'm a foreman for a logging crew in Pine Bar, Washington Territory. Life's rough. Winter's rougher. Need a partner. Not a porcelain doll." Eleanor smiled as she read it. Finally, a man who didn't want lace and giggles. She wrote back, "I'm tall. I work hard. I don't need pampering." 2 weeks later, a one-way ticket arrived with the name Thomas Beckett written in pencil. She boarded the coach with one wool coat, a canvas bag she'd sewn herself, and a small hope, not for love exactly, but for a place to belong. Someone who wouldn't flinch when he looked up. But when the stage pulled into Pine Bar and the dust settled, there was no one waiting. Only a boy 16, maybe holding a folded note. "Miss Grace," he asked. She nodded. He handed her the paper. "Apologies. Saw you step down. Didn't expect you to be that tall. Wouldn't work. Best of luck. T. Beckett." She stood still. The world had gone quiet again the way it always did when disappointment arrived. Not angry, not dramatic, just hollow. The boy shifted. "Ma'am, you okay?" Eleanor nodded gently. "Yes, just need a minute." She sat on the edge of a crate near the platform, too tall for the bench, too tired to pretend. Across the street, behind a wagon stacked high with fresh-cut logs, a man covered in sawdust watched her. His arms were thick from years of work, his beard full, his eyes not startled. He didn't whisper, didn't smirk. He just said under his breath, "Huh." And sometimes that's how it starts. Not with fireworks, but with someone who doesn't ask you to shrink. What happens when a woman always told to be smaller is finally met by a man who sees her just as she is? The man behind the lumber wagon didn't introduce himself right away. He waited until the boy had walked off and Eleanor had stopped looking like she might crumple. Then he approached. Big hands, broad shoulders, sleeves rolled up. He had the kind of steady walk that said he didn't waste effort. His voice when it came was low and calm like a saw running smooth through pine. "You're Miss Grace?" he asked. She looked up guarded. "I am." He glanced at the letter still in her hand, then looked back at her face. Not her height, not her boots, her face. "Sorry about Beckett," he said. "He's got strong opinions. Not much spine." She blinked. "You know him," he nodded. "Foreman at the East Mill. Technically my boss. Doesn't mean I have to agree with him." She waited. He stuck out a hand. "Cal Callahan. I run the West Camp. We're always short of help, especially the kind that can reach the top shelf without a ladder." That caught her off guard. "Are you offering me a job?" she said. "I'm offering you supper first," he replied, "and then we'll see." It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't pity. It was simple, decent kindness, the kind that doesn't announce itself. He brought her to a bunkhouse cabin near the edge of the forest. The table was rough-hewn, the chairs mismatched. But there was stew on the stove and a chair sturdy enough to hold her without creaking. They ate mostly in silence, which suited her fine. Only once did he ask, "How long did you travel 9 days?" she said. Not counting the years before it. He gave a small grunt of understanding. "You seem like someone who knows what hard things feel like," he said. "Don't we all?" She thought the moment might end there. But then he said, "Difference is you wear it like a spine. Some folks wear it like bitterness." She wasn't used to compliments, especially not from men who didn't follow them with a suggestion or a smile that curled too long, so she said nothing. But when he offered her the extra cot in the far room, she didn't hesitate. And when she lay down that night staring at the ceiling of rough wood, she felt safe, not settled, not certain, but safe enough to sleep. What happens when a woman used to being overlooked is finally seen not for what she lacks, but for what she holds inside? The next morning, Eleanor rose with the sun. She moved quietly out of habit, even though no one in the bunkhouse had asked her to. She brewed coffee the way her mother taught her, strong and silent, letting it speak for itself. Cal came in from chopping kindling, hair damp with sweat flannel rolled to the elbows. "Smells like a better start than usual," he said, nodding toward the pot. She poured him a cup without a word. He accepted it with a nod. That became their rhythm. He didn't ask her to explain herself. She didn't pretend to be smaller than she was. Instead, she swept the porch. She organized the kitchen shelves. She mended shirts, hoed the frost-hardened garden, and fixed the loose step that had been ignored for months. One afternoon, Cal returned from the mill early and found her carrying a crate of firewood to the shed. "You planning to rebuild the cabin?" he teased. She wiped her brow. "I like being useful. You already are." She froze just for a moment, because no one had said that to her in years. "Not you're sweet, not you're fine for your size, but you are useful." Like strength had value. Like her being here had weight that didn't need softening. That night she sat beside the hearth reading a letter she never intended to send, a draft to her sister back east, explaining where she was, and how strange it felt to be somewhere she wasn't being measured every minute. And yet even in the comfort, the old voice in her mind whispered, "He's just being kind. He'll change his mind too." Because she knew how it went. Men like tall women only in stories. They liked novelty, not presence. They liked a woman who'd kneel, not one who stood even when others didn't. So she asked Cal that evening, as rain pattered the roof, "Why didn't you flinch when you saw me step off that coach?" He looked at her like it was the strangest question in the world. "Why would I?" he said. "You're the first person I've met who makes this cabin look small." She laughed, startled, real, the kind of sound she hadn't made since childhood. "Most men find that uncomfortable." Cal leaned back in his chair, arms folded. "Most men spend their lives trying to look bigger than they are. Me, I've always been more interested in someone who walks tall without trying." The fire crackled, and for the first time since arriving in Pine Bar, Eleanor felt the warmth reach all the way to her bones. But when the walls start to come down, can she believe that someone like her is worth staying for, not despite who she is, but because of it? So far, How has Eleanor's story made you feel? Have you ever been told you were too much of something? Too tall, too quiet, too strong, and spent years trying to shrink yourself into what others found comfortable? Maybe you've known that ache of standing in a room and still feeling invisible, or hearing kindness and wondering if it was just pity in disguise. Eleanor has spent her whole life folding herself in just to fit, but now for the first time she's in a place where she doesn't have to apologize for taking up space, where a man doesn't just tolerate her presence, he measures the world around her. But when you've lived with rejection long enough, even warmth can feel suspicious. And that's where we find Eleanor now standing on the edge of something that might be love, but wondering if her footing is real. So the question is, what happens next when someone who's always been afraid of being too much has to decide if she'll let herself be fully seen? Stay with us. The hardest part, and the most beautiful, is just ahead. The first time Cal touched her hand, it wasn't romantic. They were unloading timber from the wagon hands, raw and aching. She had just gritted through a splinter, hiding the pain behind her usual composure, when he noticed her wince. Without a word, he reached over and took her hand, big and rough as it was, and examined the wound. His fingers, thick from years of saw work, moved with a surprising tenderness. "That'll fester if we leave it," he said, then reached for his flask. She tensed. "What are you doing cleaning it?" "You all right?" She nodded. He poured a splash of spirits on the splintered skin. It stung. She didn't flinch. But what startled her most wasn't the pain. It was the way he didn't hesitate. No hesitation at her size. No hesitance to help. Just calm hands. Just care. Later that night, when they sat by the hearth again, as they often did, he asked quietly, "Did it hurt much, the rejection?" "I mean," she stared into the fire. "More than it should have," she admitted. "I told myself not to expect anything. But I did." Cal nodded. "We always do." "He didn't even speak to me," she added. "Just saw my height and decided I was wrong." "He was a fool," Cal said. She turned to him. "Do you really not mind it? Mind what that I'm taller than you? That people stare? That I don't fit neatly into the image?" He chuckled. "You think I care what people expect of women? I live in a shack with a one-eyed cat and a broken porch step. Neat isn't part of my vocabulary." That made her smile. "You wear your height like it was a fault," he said, his tone gentler now. "But I see it different. How you stand like someone who's had to stand alone. That's strength. Not something you should shrink to make others feel bigger." The words hit something deep, like a locked door inside her had been knocked on, not forced open, just gently tapped, waiting to be noticed. That night when she climbed into her cot, she stared at the rafters and whispered, "I don't want to live small anymore." The silence didn't answer, but her own heart did. She didn't want to be tolerated. She wanted to be chosen. And now, she was starting to believe she might be. But what happens when the world outside, the one that never made room for her, finds its way back to the door? Will she still stand tall? Or will the old fear pull her down again? Pine Bar was a small place. It didn't take long for word to spread that Beckett's bride hadn't left town after all. And when folks heard she was staying out by the West Mill in Cal Callahan's bunkhouse, no less, the whispers began. "You seen her, like a pine tree in a dress. Heard she carries her own firewood. Wonder if he's got a stool to kiss her goodnight." Eleanor heard none of it directly, but she'd learned to read stares. She saw the smirks, the sideways glances at the general store when Cal stood beside her in the line, and didn't flinch when she ducked under the doorframe. That night she sat on the porch, arms folded tight, staring at her boots. "You all right?" Cal asked, settling beside her. She shrugged. "They're talking," she said. "They've always talked," he replied. "About me. You think they talked less when it was just me and my busted porch?" She smiled a little, but it didn't last. "It's not the whispers," she admitted. "It's what they don't say. The looks. Like I'm something to laugh at." "Eleanor," he said gently, "you've been laughed at by men too small to look you in the eye. But you've stood taller through more storms than any of them." She didn't answer. So he added, "Let them look. Let them wonder. The truth is, most people are scared of anything that doesn't fit their little picture. But I've never wanted a painting. I wanted something real." She turned to him slowly. "And that's what you see every day," he said. A woman real enough to carry her own weight and brave enough to let someone else carry it too when needed. The next morning she walked into the bakery in town alone. The bell jingled. The same men who'd watched her whisper before looked up. She stood straight, chin high. 2 loaves, she said to the baker, her voice steady, and a bag of rye flour. She paid, turned, and looked every one of them in the eye. She didn't rush out. She didn't duck. She didn't shrink. That evening, Cal found her planting onions near the cabin. "You go into town?" he asked. She nodded, and she dusted her hands on her apron. They looked. "I let them." "You all right?" She looked up at him, for the first time in a long while. "I think I am." But just as Eleanor learns to stand firm in who she is, a ghost from her past arrives, one that threatens to knock her down all over again. The letter came folded in quarters, smudged with dust and pride. It arrived by coach, tucked between an order for nails and a catalog of seed. Cal brought it to her, as he always did, with calm hands and no assumptions. "Your name's on it," he said, setting it on the table. Eleanor didn't need to read the return address. She recognized the handwriting. Samuel Harker. The first man she ever loved or thought she had. He was her neighbor back east, handsome and confident, with a laugh that turned heads and a way of calling her Ellie that made her blush. For a time she thought they might marry, until he said one afternoon while adjusting his tie in her family's parlor, "You'd make a fine wife if only I didn't have to stand on a stool to kiss you." He chuckled. She didn't. It ended there, or so she'd thought. Now, years later, here he was again. She opened the letter with steady hands. "Ellie, I hear you've gone out west. I find myself recently widowed, and truth be told, I always missed your good sense. Life has a way of humbling us, doesn't it? Perhaps we might write. I'd be open to renewing our acquaintance." There was no apology, no mention of the words that once turned her to stone, just an offer wrapped in a self-interest. She folded it quietly, didn't speak for a long time. When Cal came in later that evening, he found her by the stove staring into nothing. "Everything all right?" he asked. She handed him the letter. He read it once, frowned. "You want to write him back?" "No," she said. "But I hate that it still hurts." He nodded. "It's not the man," she added. "It's the memory of who I used to be. How quickly I'd have said yes, just to feel wanted." She turned away, but Cal stepped closer. "You are wanted," he said quietly, "but not for nostalgia, not for convenience. You're wanted now, just as you are." She looked up at him. For the first time, she let her height be what it was, a line she didn't cross to fit into someone else's frame. "Do you ever feel small, Cal?" she asked, not teasing. He smiled. "Only when I realize how lucky I am." That night she burned the letter, not in anger, but in closure, because finally she understood her worth wasn't up for negotiation, and it never had been. But once you know your own worth, can you open your heart to something as fragile and powerful as love? Spring in Pine Bar came slow and stubborn. The snow melted in patches, leaving behind muddy trails and the scent of pine waking from sleep. Cal's garden began to bud in shy greens, and the cabin, once only filled with dust and sawdust, now smelled faintly of lavender and warm bread. Eleanor stood on the porch one evening, watching clouds drift like thoughts. She held a mug of tea with both hands, her long frame wrapped in a shawl she'd knitted herself. Behind her, Cal stepped out quietly. He didn't say much. He rarely did. But he looked at her like the sky might fall if she ever left. "You think it's foolish?" she asked, still watching the horizon. "What's that 2 people like us? Late in life, bruised in our own ways." Cal leaned on the railing beside her. "I think," he said slowly, "we were never meant to fit in because we were meant to fit together." Silence. Then he reached into his pocket. Not with a box, not with a ring, but with a carved wooden button, smooth oval, warm from his hand. "I made this from a piece of the first tree we cut together," he said. "Thought maybe you'd sew it onto something we'd both wear." She blinked. "That's your way of asking. Only if you say yes." She smiled, the kind of smile that came from a place deeper than joy. A smile born from survival, from finally being seen and staying seen. "Yes," she said, "but I won't be the one to stoop for a kiss." He laughed. "Good," he said. "Wouldn't want you to." That summer, they planted a row of sunflowers tall enough to match her. He built a new bench on the porch, just wide enough for two, and every evening after the sun dipped behind the ridge, they sat side by side, no one shrinking, no one towering, just together. And when people passed by and whispered, "That's the woman who was too tall for a husband," Cal would smile and say, "No, she was just the right height for me to grow into." In a world that kept asking her to bend, Eleanor finally found a place where she could stand tall and stay. Not because she changed herself, not because she became smaller, but because someone finally saw that she didn't need to. And maybe that's the quiet lesson in this story, that the love worth holding on to doesn't ask us to crouch. It meets us at eye level, wherever that may be. Cal didn't rescue Eleanor. He didn't flatter her or fix her. He just stayed beside her with her and built a life where no one had to shrink to belong. So maybe you've been told you're too much, too tall, too different, too hard to love. But maybe, like Eleanor, you were never too much. You were just too rare for the wrong places. And if that speaks to your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment. Have you ever felt like you had to hide who you are to be loved? Would you like to hear more stories like Eleanor's? And if this story meant something to you, please subscribe to None Wild West Saga, where we tell stories that don't shout, but whisper straight to the heart. Because sometimes the quietest stories are the ones we carry with us the longest.